The Rachel O'Reilly case, one of Ireland's most violent crimes. When a person disappears without a trace or dies in mysterious circumstances, usually the other half is among the main suspects. Unfortunately, in about 80% of cases, suspicions are justified. In such crimes, there is usually not even a clear motive, and the crime itself has been defined as domestic, as if it were something ordinary. In the early 2000s, the high-profile case of Rachel O'Reilly literally shocked the whole of Ireland with its unprecedented cruelty and cold-bloodedness. A young woman and mother of 2 young children was brutally murdered in her own home, and police officers who arrived on the scene admitted that they had never in their practice encountered such a horrific crime scene. To solve this mystery and put all the pieces of the puzzle together, it took investigators several years of painstaking work. All this time, the criminal remained at large and was sure that his guilt no one and never prove. Perhaps it would have happened, but the killer was let down by his own vanity. Well, let's take the whole story from the beginning. Who was Rachel O'Reilly? Rachel O'Reilly, maiden name Callally, was born in 1974 on the northern outskirts of County Dublin, Ireland. His biological parents' girl did not know. At an early age, she was adopted by spouses Rose and Jim Callally, and she was brought up with 4 other adopted children of the couple. Their own heirs Rose and Jim could not have, so all their parental love without a trace gave foster children. From a small age, Rachel was an active and purposeful child. She studied well in school, played sports, helped her parents in the household, and never caused any problems. The girl grew up sociable, open, and incredibly kind. She easily got along with everyone and avoided any conflicts. As a teenager, Rachel was seriously engaged in softball, constantly took part in various competitions, and even set several local records. She also had a very strong bond with her foster mother, to whom she confided all her secrets and with whom she communicated constantly, even after she married and had children of her own. After graduating from high school, the girl enrolled in one of the local universities, deciding to get a degree in marketing. At the same time, she got a job as a salesperson in a city department store, and in her spare time, she continued to play sports, playing for the local team. Who is Joe O'Reilly? In fact, there is not much information about Joe O'Reilly's early life in public sources. He was famous for his inhumanity and extreme cruelty to his own spouse and the mother of his 2 children. But what kind of person he was as a young man is hardly ever talked about or remembered. It is known that Joe is also a native of County Dublin, where he was born in 1972 in a simple family. He was the second common child of his parents and was raised with his older sister. The children of the O'Reilly couple were not spoiled, and parents taught them that in life, everything should be achieved independently by their own efforts and hard work. The boy was quite tall, athletic, and was also fond of softball. After graduating from high school, he decided to study advertising by correspondence, and to earn a living, he got a job as a manager in a department store, the same department store where Rachel came a few months later. At the time of their first meeting, Joe was 19 years old, and Rachel was barely 17. The young man immediately noticed the new employee and took the initiative to be the first to meet her. Miniature smiling blonde literally dizzy the guy's head, but only to go on a date with him. She, for some reason, categorically refused. Joe began to woo Rachel, said compliments, made little surprises in the form of flowers or chocolates at her workplace at the beginning of the day, but Rachel still remained cold to him. Desperate attempts to get the attention of the young saleswoman, with interest, watched almost the entire staff of the department store, and it even became a reason for jokes. However, Joe did not give up. He read Rachel's favorite book, so that they have a common topic for conversation. But it was only when Joe found out that Rachel was a serious softball player that things got off the ground. That's when he joined her at the stadium and walked onto the field during practice and joined the game. Since O'Reilly was long and familiar with softball, he showed all his skills and led the team to victory. This time, the young man managed to impress Rachel, and she finally agreed to go on a date with him. Their relationship developed rapidly, and Joe, by all means and available ways to show that he is ready for the beloved to literally roll mountains. he unexpectedly organized for his beloved a trip to the most romantic city in the world, Paris, and there, on top of the Eiffel Tower, he asked for her hand in marriage. Of course, Rachel could not resist and answered him in agreement. Then the naive girl thought that she met a real prince from a magical fairy tale, with whom she will live a long and happy life. A few years later, the couple married, and then, one after the other, they had 2 sons in common. The couple moved to the quiet and picturesque Scottish province of Nahuel, where they purchased their own spacious, cozy home. It was the perfect place to raise their children. After the birth of their eldest son, Rachel left her job and became a housewife, devoting herself to the care of her husband and child. And 2 years later, the couple had a second son. So the young mother was completely absorbed by the heirs, and the main gainer in the family was Joe, who got a job in an advertising agency as a specialist in outdoor advertising. Those who were personally acquainted with the head of the family described him as a confident, purposeful, and not devoid of charming man. At work, he proved himself as a responsible, qualified specialist, punctual, and attentive. He was the first to arrive at the office, and always stayed late if the situation required it. Joe also continued to be active in sports, often stopping by the gym before the workday began, and in his and his wife's house, there were several exercise machines and a set of dumbbells. Over time, when the boys grew up a little and began to attend kindergarten, Rachel, in order to have their own additional income, became a distributor for one of the popular cosmetics companies and also sold household goods. Such work allowed her to communicate more with neighbors, who spoke of her as a wonderful mother, a kind and open person. As time went on, Joe became less and less likely to come home. In fact, he came only to sleep, shower, and change his clothes. This behavior he wrote off the total employment at work and the upcoming promotion, which he was so looking forward to. His wife supported him as best she could, but gradually they began to drift apart, and family relations deteriorated markedly. In the summer of 2004, there was one extremely unpleasant event. An anonymous person sent a letter to Child Protective Services, which stated that Rachel is a bad mother and mistreats her sons, who at that time were 4 and 2 years old. In this regard, a special commission visited the couple's home and responded to the disturbing report. Although nothing suspicious was found, and all relatives and neighbors described Mrs. O'Reilly as a loving and caring mother, the letter cast a shadow on her reputation. What happened to Rachel O'Reilly? The morning of Monday, October 4th, 2004, began as usual. The head of the family left the house at dawn, while his wife and sons were still asleep, and went to work. Throughout the day, he texted and called his wife several times, but there was no answer. Then he called his home phone, but the answering machine went off, and Joe said in a shaky voice that he was very worried and asked his wife to call him back as soon as possible. In the afternoon, Joe received a call from the kindergarten teacher saying that Rachel had not come to pick up the boys, which had never happened before. Then Joe called his mother-in-law and asked if she knew where Rachel was, and when she said no, he asked Rose to go to their house and see if everything was all right. In the meantime, he went to the kindergarten to pick up the children. When Rose arrived at her daughter's home, she saw her car in the yard and realized that Rachel was home. However, the room itself was dark and quiet, and no one answered her call. The first thing that caught Rose's eye was the clutter, as if the house had been searched for something. Cabinets and drawers were open, their contents strewn on the floor. The whole thing looked like a robbery. The landlady was nowhere to be found, but when her mother entered the bedroom, a horrifying picture appeared before her eyes. Rachel was lying on the floor in a huge pool of her own blood. There was blood everywhere, on the walls, furniture, and even the ceiling. And through Rachel's bloody, tangled hair, in some places the bare bones of her skull could be seen. Rose rushed to her daughter, hoping she was still alive and could be helped, but when she touched her arm, she felt the limb was cold and stiff. Rachel had been dead for hours, and there was no way to help her. Unable to remember herself, Rose started screaming and calling for help, and then rushed to the phone to call the police. At her screams, the neighbors, among whom was a doctor, came running. He was the first to examine the body and confirmed that Rachel could not be helped. When Joe arrived at the house, there was already a crowd of people there. When he learned that his spouse was dead, he screamed and ran inside, saying he didn't believe it. In the bedroom, by his wife's body, he became hysterical. O'Reilly cried, screamed, and promised to kill whoever had done this to his beloved wife. According to police officers who arrived on the scene, they have never seen a more brutal picture of the massacre of a defenseless woman in their practice. Obviously, the weapon of the crime was some heavy blunt object, which Rachel was beaten with incredible ferocity. There's literally nothing left on her body. Apparently, the owner of the house was attacked from behind because she did not even try to resist or fight back. The overall picture really resembled a robbery, but professional instinct told the investigators that such a beating only with personal motives or acute dislike. But who would have a hand on a petite young woman and mother of 2 children? The first thing detectives did was to interview family members and neighbors of the deceased. All of them confidently stated that Rachel had no enemies or ill-wishers, and that she was on friendly terms with everyone. Neighbors on that day did not notice anything suspicious. No strange cars or any strangers near the victim's house. Joe stated that he had been at the bus depot on the other side of town most of the day, where he had gone for work, and his alibi could be confirmed by a co-worker. The co-worker did confirm Joe's words, but the police were still haunted by vague doubts. Something was definitely wrong here. The situation looked like a robbery, but nothing of value had been taken, only scattered items. In the bedside table of the bedroom, almost in plain sight, lay €1,000, which remained untouched. Another stash was in a kitchen cupboard, but this too was untouched. There was also a jewelry box on the dressing table, but only a pair of chains and earrings were missing, lying separately in a drawer. In addition, according to the homeowner, a digital camera, silverware, and one of his dumbbells, which was probably the weapon of crime, were missing. It all seemed too strange. The house was turned upside down, the landlady brutally murdered, and all this over some little thing. Joe, answering police questions, was crying, shaking, and feverish, but as one of the investigators later admitted, it seemed to him that such a state of the guy was not grief or shock at all, but rather like nervous excitement. O'Reilly behaved even more strangely when asked if his wife might have had an affair on the side. Joe changed his face and confidently stated that there was no such thing, and then added that he had not cheated on his wife, but this phrase sounded very unconvincing. 2 miles from the scene of the crime, in the bushes, was found a bag with things missing from the house. Inside was a camera, silverware, and a couple of pieces of jewelry. All items were from the list of stolen items that Joe had compiled. Now the robbery theory could be dismissed completely, and the case could be reclassified as premeditated murder. Suspicious widower. In spite of all the widowed fellow's attempts to portray grief and pain, it looked fake, and he immediately became the main suspect. Joe had nothing to present yet, but the detectives had to check his alibi in detail to study the scene of the crime and learn about their relationship with his wife. Joe said that in the morning before work, he decided to stop by the gym, which he did regularly, and the surveillance cameras in the parking lot, as well as in the gym itself, confirmed it. He then drove to the office, and from there he went to a bus station in a remote part of the city in order to monitor the placement of advertisements on vehicles. His words were confirmed by a colleague with whom he allegedly called at the time. The investigators then went to Joe's workplace, where they seized his computer for inspection. This is where the most interesting part began, because the email contained strange correspondence, which Joe had partially deleted. Specialists were able to recover the deleted messages, and the police were finally convinced that they were going in the right direction. Most often, Joe corresponded with his friend and his own sister, and to both of them he constantly complained about his wife. He wrote about Rachel using insults and profanity. He wrote that his wife had not attracted him as a woman for a long time, and in general, causes him outright disgust. Moreover, the computer found another curious correspondence between Joe and one of his colleagues, a woman named Nikki Pelly. From their communication, it was clear that these two were much closer than just friends, and they should both be questioned. Who's Nikki Pelly? Nikki also worked for an advertising company, and she and Joe had a lot of work-related interactions. The woman was 10 years older than Joe, but that didn't stop them from having an affair. When exactly began their workplace romance, it was not possible to establish, But it was at her Joe spent evenings and even nights, and his wife lied about the fact that too busy with work. But this was not the strangest thing in the discovered correspondence. It turned out that Joe had promised Nikki in his messages that they would soon be together. He, she, and their sons, referring to his children with Rachel. Such messages were more than suspicious because in the event of a divorce, the boys would be left to live with their mother. Joe, who initially claimed that he had no affairs on the side, realized that it was pointless to deny it because irrefutable evidence of his infidelity was found. Then he admitted that he had indeed been secretly dating Nikki for a while, but then they allegedly broke up. For more than a week, the O'Reilly house was cordoned off as a crime scene, and no one was allowed in because the police needed to scrutinize and document everything. During this time, Joe was staying with his sister and the boys were staying with their grandparents. At the funeral, Joe didn't look like a grieving widower. He acted remarkably calm, and most importantly, as if he was shunning the coffin with his late wife. When it was his turn to say goodbye, he did so quickly, coldly, and as he left, he indifferently said that the coffin could be closed and buried. When the family was allowed to return home, everything there looked as it had on the day of the crime, except for the body on the floor. Joe asked his father-in-law and mother-in-law to go with him, and they agreed, figuring he needed the support. On the spot, however, the son-in-law suddenly began to speculate about how the killer might have dealt with Rachel. He walked around the room in which his wife had been murdered and described how she had been attacked, the force with which she had been struck, pointing each time to dried blood spatters. Joe then suggested that the perpetrator might have gone to the bathroom to wash the blood off his hands and the crime weapon, which he then took with him. His account was horrifyingly detailed and full of detail, with Joe also waving his arms around to mimic the blows. However, his grief-stricken parents wrote off his behavior as an attempt to relieve stress and talk it out. Although Rose later admitted that all this time, she did not let go of the idea that the son-in-law repeats the actions committed by him earlier, and it was he who massacred their daughter. Thirst for fame. Almost immediately after the funeral, O'Reilly began to actively communicate with the press, giving interviews left and right. He willingly invited reporters to his home, literally arranging them tours of the scene of the crime, and described how everything happened. At the same time, Joe every time on camera addressed the criminal, offering him to voluntarily surrender to the police. 3 weeks after the tragedy, the loved ones of the deceased agreed to participate in the shooting of a TV program devoted to this crime. But if Rachel's parents were depressed and literally killed by grief, then Joe on the set behaved as if he was a star. He vividly communicated with the makeup artists, interested in how he will look like in the frame, and in the breaks eagerly nibbled on the proposed treats, drinking their coffee. The police, who were still looking at Joe, decided to follow him, and found that from the set he went straight to his mistress, Nikki, who spent the night. By that time, the last doubts that he was the killer had already been dispelled, and it remained only to collect irrefutable evidence for the court. Gathering evidence was a very long, complicated, and painstaking process because the most important thing, the instrument of the crime, was not found. Nevertheless, there was enough other evidence. The first to speak were Nikki and the colleague who had confirmed Joe's alibi. They were both facing jail time for perjury, so they decided not to risk their freedom. Nikki admitted that she and Joe had not broken up at all, as they claimed earlier, but continued their relationship. Moreover, about their connection found out Rachel, because of which the spouses had a big scandal on the eve of the tragedy. The colleague, however, said that he was not sure whether Joe was at the time of his wife's murder at the bus station on the other side of the city. The guy simply confirmed his friend's words at his request, not knowing at the time that O'Reilly was a suspect in the crime. Recovered correspondence from Joe's computer, in which he insulted his wife and planned his future with his mistress and children, was also attached to the case. The police also examined numerous interviews with Joe and footage from the TV program and concluded that he described the crime in the kind of detail that only a criminal could know. In part, it was the widower's careless remarks that made it possible to reconstruct the full picture of the crime. In the morning, he really went to the gym, deliberately getting into the lenses of all the cameras there, Then he also warned his colleagues that he would be absent from the office because he would leave for work in another part of the city and his phone may not be available. Then he went not to the bus station, as he said, but to his home, where he armed himself with a dumbbell and hid in the marital bedroom, waiting for his wife, who had left to take the children to kindergarten. He attacked her suddenly, from behind, leaving no chance of escape. After the massacre, Joe, as he himself admitted, washed off the blood from himself and the murder weapon in the bathroom adjacent to the bedroom. The perpetrator then changed his clothes, scattered his belongings around the house to simulate a robbery, and went to work. On the way, he threw the items away and disposed of the soiled clothes and dumbbells so that they would not be found. He also thoughtfully called his already murdered wife's cell phone several times, sent her a couple of messages and recorded voicemails on the answering machine, asking her to call him back. In the office, he was acting strangely and looked overexcited, and his hands were shaking slightly. Some of his colleagues noticed this and asked if he was all right. But Joe was confused, and instead of answering, he hurried to his office, where he soon received a call from the daycare center, informing him that the boys had not been picked up. He did not hurry to go home, but instead sent his mother-in-law to be the first to find his daughter's disfigured body. He thought he had thought of everything, and that his guilt would be impossible to prove, but his thirst for fame and public attention played against him. Joe was not taken into custody until 2 years after his crime. Despite the fact that most of the evidence was circumstantial, Joe's guilt was proved by reconstructing the entire route of his movements that day on the signal of a cell phone, with which he did not part. It is noteworthy that at the time of Rachel's murder, Joe's cell phone signal came from the family home. It was verified later with the help of billing. In addition, it was revealed at trial that the anonymous letter to Child Protective Services was written by Joe's mother at the request of her son. Joe knew that he would not have sole custody of the boys in the event of a divorce, so he tried to smear his wife by making her look like a bad and abusive mother. But social services officials found no corroboration for what the anonymous message said, so O'Reilly decided to act, for sure. He felt no remorse. He smiled in the courtroom, talked animatedly with his defense attorneys, and even tried to joke, believing that he would be released anyway. But in the summer of 2007, the court found Joe guilty and sentenced him to life imprisonment. The lawyers tried to challenge this decision, but all their complaints and appeals were rejected. It is noteworthy that the relationship between Joe and Nikki continued even after the guy went to prison. His mistress visited him regularly for many years, but in 2022, for unknown reasons, they stopped communicating. Joe O'Reilly never pleaded guilty. In prison, he has become a model inmate who never causes any trouble, hoping to achieve parole eligibility one day. A broken vase can never be mended, goes the famous saying, symbolizing irreversible harm or betrayal. A fragile vessel may be pieced back together, yet its cracks linger, forever altering its appearance and utility. This analogy hits close to home for survivors of intimate exploitation. Historically, our society has often tried to diminish the pain of such experiences to avoid causing discomfort to others. However, our culture and legal systems have evolved. Individuals who have suffered these indignities are now sharing their stories and receiving the support they need, propelled by dire incidents that could not be ignored. Among these is the tragic story of Antonia Barra from Chile, around which the entire national community rallied to ensure justice was served against her aggressor. The loss of the young woman became known on the evening of October 13th, 2019. Her family could never have envisioned how that day would conclude. Her sister Carla, visiting their parents' home, went upstairs to say hello to Antonia, expecting a casual chat. However, finding her seemingly asleep, Carla chose not to disturb her and headed to the door. Before she could leave, she heard Antonia ask about their mother and request the light be turned off. After telling Carla she loved her, Antonia turned away. Maybe she's just tired or not in the mood, thought Carla. Little did she know, Antonia was grappling with harrowing thoughts that left her feeling there was only one way out from her profound distress. By 7 that evening, their mother, not hearing any response from Antonia's room, entered to find a harrowing scene. Her daughter was motionless, suspended above the floor. Marcella rushed to her, finding no signs of life. Overwhelmed by shock, she sought assistance from neighbors. The family friends helped take down the body and called for emergency services. Shortly afterward, Alejandro Barra addressed the media, vowing to uncover the root causes of his daughter's desperate act and to seek justice. Known for her vivacity and intelligence, it was clear that something significant had profoundly impacted Antonia. The autopsy confirmed self-strangulation as the cause of death. The case required immediate action. Not waiting for official inquiries, the parents initiated their own investigation. Private detectives meticulously pieced together the last days of Antonia's life, identifying the individual who had driven her to despair. Promptly, Alejandro and Marcella reported Martin Pradenas to the police, suspecting him of exploitation. There was little known about him. He was born and lived in Temuco, Chile, the same city as Antonia. He came from a large family, parents, a sister, and a brother. The dynamics within his family are unclear, as there is scant information available online, which is justified later. Undoubtedly, in his early youth, a young woman named Daniela Alvarez bore his child. Nonetheless, the relationship between the two did not last long. After the birth, the couple parted ways. Detectives discovered that between 2015 and 2017, Antonia and Martin communicated via a social network. At that time, Antonia was a teenager. They exchanged messages and commented on each other's photos, though their interactions were confined to the digital realm. However, they eventually met in person, which unfortunately led to a tragic outcome. Antonia was born in the late 1980s into a strong and close-knit family. The Barra family home was large and spacious, suited to a family of their size. Loving parents Alejandro and Marcella raised 5 children, 4 daughters and 1 son. It was a household where care and attention were plentiful. The children were kind and well-behaved, causing no significant trouble. However, Antonia stood out among her siblings. She was unusually perceptive, responsible, and ambitious from a young age, which made her a particular source of pride for her parents. She excelled in school, got along well with her teachers, and had plans for her future. Antonia dreamed of traveling and leading a fulfilling life. After graduating high school, she got into her university of choice and began studying a highly sought-after major. As a freshman, she immersed herself in mastering the basics of her future profession and actively participated in academic and social activities, making new friends. Her friends shared her interests and aspirations. Antonia formed an especially close bond with Consuela Uribe, who was studying at the law school. The friends would often go out, shop, and attend parties together. They became very close. Thus, when Antonia broke up with her boyfriend Rodrigo, Consuela suggested she distract herself from the heartbreak. Antonia was struggling with the breakup, so she embraced her friend's idea. She wanted to clear her mind and temporarily forget the past. The friends planned a trip for Chile's Independence Day on September 18th. Their destination was the tourist town of Pucón. By sheer coincidence, it was there that Martin and Antonia's paths crossed again. Martin was planning to attend an electronic music festival. The event was to be held at a local club called Black Room, where a DJ friend of his was performing. On September 17th, around 6:30 p.m., Uribe and Barra set off for Pucón with 3 other friends, one of whom was Consuela's boyfriend. The journey went smoothly, and upon arrival, the young people stayed in different accommodations. The girls stayed in a summer house owned by the Urad family. After 8 p.m., the friends began preparing for a party at the popular venue, Black Room. The night promised a sea of unforgettable emotions. Before leaving, Antonia exchanged messages with her father, who asked her to be careful and cautious around strangers. In response, she reassured her father, writing that prudence was her foremost trait. Law enforcement officials repeatedly interviewed Martin Pradenas, but he denied any wrongdoing regarding Antonia. He claimed their intimacy was consensual and vehemently denied any involvement in her tragic end. However, detectives had their own perspective and evidence regarding the matter. During the investigation, it was established that Martin left Temuco on September 17 around noon, accompanied by friends. They planned to return the next day. Upon reaching their destination, the group held a party at a rented house, filled with conversation, jokes, and of course, alcohol. Meanwhile, Antonia and Consuela got ready and headed to the club. There, they ordered a table, food, and drinks. The friends enjoyed themselves, chatting and dancing extensively. Needless to say, the Black Room Club became the venue for the young people's unexpected reunion. The chance meeting delighted them, and the man and woman spent the evening together, chatting and dancing. It was clear they were fond of each other. Antonia occasionally left him to return to her friend, who was also enjoying herself, and to greet the male acquaintances with whom she had traveled. Moving from one bar to another, she didn't realize how carried away she got with the alcohol, likely due to the long drive and an empty stomach, something she usually did not allow herself to do. Around 6:45 a.m., Consuela found her friend pleasantly chatting with a mutual acquaintance, Emilio. At that point, she told Antonia it was time to leave. Antonia refused, feeling good and wanting to continue the evening. Her friend advised her to stop drinking and reconsider her decision, but Antonia was adamant and chose to stay at the club while Consuela left. This turned out to be a regrettable decision for Antonia. Emilio became an unwitting witness to the events that unfolded afterwards, which he detailed during the investigation and in court. He noted that Martin approached Antonia and started a conversation with her. He then took her by the hand and led her towards the exit. Emilio remarked that Antonia acted oddly, unsure whether she was engaging in the conversation or just confused due to the alcohol. Nevertheless, it seemed she did not mind being led away, or perhaps she was unaware of it. Emilio assumed that the man had invited her to join him, and she agreed. Nonetheless, external surveillance footage told a different story. Martin's friends recounted that they left the club in 2 cars, but there was no room for the pair in either vehicle. Therefore, they proceeded on foot. Along the way, they came across a store. Surveillance footage made it clear that the man coerced the woman into entering. She could barely stand and was unable to resist. Martin, slightly more sober, was able to somewhat control the situation. Throughout the night, they were captured on camera several times. Along the way, Credinas was overly affectionate and tried to kiss his companion, who did not reciprocate and tried to pull away. Upon entering the rented house, none of his friends paid much attention to the woman. Only 19-year-old Barbara, who had joined recently and hadn't been drinking, noticed that the couple was intoxicated. Afterward, they went upstairs. Around 9 a.m., Consuela received a voice message from her friend. Initially, she couldn't make out what was being said. After listening more carefully, she understood a few words. Antonia was pleading to be picked up. Since her friend didn't know her exact location, she used GPS to find it. Consuela, accompanied by her boyfriend Jose, went to the designated location. Upon entering the house, they were met by a naked Martin, who was covering himself with a pillow. When Consuela asked him where her friend was, he claimed he didn't know. They found Barra in one of the upstairs rooms, lying on a bed in her underwear, quietly crying. Jose picked her up and carried her to the car. Consuela asked what had happened, but Antonia could only cry. The young couple tried to console her, hugging and attempting to engage her in conversation. Back at the summer house, Antonia confessed everything. Martin had exploited her against her will, and she felt powerless to stop it. Her memories were hazy. She couldn't recall much, but one thing was clear: he had wronged her. This occurred when they went upstairs. Afterwards, he left her alone and disappeared. Upon hearing about the incident, Jose and Consuela insisted that Antonia report the scoundrel to the police and seek justice. However, she refused, fearing that her parents and the public would find out. She chose to quietly endure the trauma and try to recover on her own. She asked them to tell no one about the incident. During this heartfelt conversation, Antonia received a message from her father asking how she was doing and joking about whether she had been drinking too much. To avoid arousing suspicion, she tried to respond in her usual manner, thereby inadvertently highlighting her own intentions. The next day, Antonia met with Martin to talk. However, he was dismissive and arrogant. He insisted that the events of the previous night had been consensual. At that point, Antonia realized that she would not hear the truth or receive an apology. She knew she had to try to move on. Later, psychotherapists invited to the court hearing will explain that at the time, Antonia was experiencing intimacy trauma syndrome. It's characterized by disruptions in physical, emotional, cognitive, and interpersonal behavior. This condition can appear immediately following the incident or even months, and sometimes years later. The poor girl was suffering through an acute stage alone. She could not rid herself of distressing sensations, distraction, anxiety, confusion, alternating with hysterics and crying. She undoubtedly felt a compulsive desire to cleanse herself, experiencing bouts of nausea or even vomiting. For 3 weeks, Barra kept silent and tried to behave as usual. A childhood friend confessed that she noticed nothing unusual about her. However, her classmates could not overlook the memory impairments and disorganization associated with the syndrome. One of them remarked on her declining academic performance, which was very uncharacteristic of the once disciplined student. When asked what was the cause, Antonia cited poor health. It should be noted that a large number of witnesses came to the girl's defense during the trial: friends, acquaintances, and classmates. But what was the turning point in making a fateful decision? Perhaps Antonia would have remained alive, sought professional help over time, had it not been for a series of events. Somehow, her terrible secret became known to an ex-boyfriend. However, the information reached him in a very unflattering form, which he hurried to report. The girl replied that she was not at fault for what had happened. The information he had was a gross exaggeration. Then Rodrigo did not believe her. Moreover, the day before the incident, Martin called. It is unclear what the conversation between them entailed, possibly threats from his side. One thing is clear: the next day the girl was gone. A few hours before her death, she sent a farewell message to her boyfriend, and in a family chat, she shared a childhood video. In it, Antonia was dancing and laughing joyfully, showing how much she missed her former self. She could not return to her previous way of life, thoughts, and actions. This tragedy made a deep impression. Thanks to Alejandro finding the strength to share his daughter's story nationwide, her tragedy resonated with the public. Antonia's name was written on posters, in social media hashtags, even on building walls. Public support had an incredible result. In less than a week, women came forward with similar claims against Pradenas. 6 new charges were filed against his name, reporting actions he took from 2010 to 2019. The man turned out to be a criminal and was taken into custody. Concurrently, Martin's family petitioned to protect their personal information, which had leaked online. The family asserted that their constitutional right to honor and respect for private life was violated, citing numerous insults, aggressive messages, and fake information online. In these actions, the Pradenas family suspected, including the Barra family. On June 12, 2020, the Temuco court granted their request. The judge required Antonia's relatives to refrain from disclosing information about the assailant's family through social media and from making compromising publications. This decision sparked outrage. Chileans were extremely upset, believing that it protected Martin. On July 21st, the Barra family filed an appeal with the Supreme Court, but it was rejected. Later that month, the suspect's lawyer submitted a petition for protective measures concerning his client. In the same month, he was officially charged with several attacks. Public outcry was gaining momentum. In Chile, the investigation became known as the Antonia case, a symbol of justice restoration for victims of violence. Many women, after many years, dared to come forward about their experiences. On July 22nd, an unexpected event occurred. The court changed the previously decided preventive measure from detention to house arrest. Martin Pradenas was effectively set free. At the same time, the judge explained that this in no way summarizes the presumed punishment. Meanwhile, the prosecutor charged Martin with 5 instances of misconduct, but the court only acknowledged 2. Massive protests swept across the country. Thousands of people took to the streets, outraged by the cessation of investigations regarding certain facts and the decision on house arrest. The authorities supported the citizens by sending a request to the appeals court. The judiciary responded immediately. It revoked the selected preventive measure and took Martin into custody. The same court later eliminated the statute of limitations for 2 cases of intimate violence. Concurrently, Alejandro, along with feminist organizations, worked on drafting a bill that would establish punishments for such crimes. He emphasized that no one should remain indifferent when a woman is led away by a man without resisting, especially while intoxicated. Barra stressed the importance of taking necessary measures in such cases, as this state makes a woman a potential victim. The investigation continued. In February 2021, Martin's phone was found. Forensic analysis revealed it contained photos in which the accused displayed women's underwear. He was clearly proud of his conquests and apparently kept account. The police report ran nearly 400 pages, including statements from victims and witnesses, people close to both Martin and Antonia, and those who had known them since childhood. The accused's childhood teacher recounted that Pradenas was a smart and cheerful child, but was very interested in topics related to intimacy. Some women recalled that when they were little, he touched them. At the time, however, no one thought much of it, as they were all children. On June 14, 2022, the criminal court in Temuco commenced its hearings, which were expected to last over a month. During this period, the prosecution presented a series of evidence, expert testimonies, and witness statements. The disclosed video footage clearly showed that Antonia was unable to control the situation. On August 26th, Martin was sentenced to 20 years of imprisonment for crimes against intimacy and acts of intimacy-related aggression. On December 29th, the Supreme Court accepted the defense's appeal, disagreeing with the verdict. A new trial was scheduled for spring 2023. Meanwhile, the efforts of the Barra family have an effect. The drafting of Antonia's law began, enhancing existing legislation to ensure that anyone committing an act of violence that pushed the victim to end their own life would be inevitably punished with imprisonment. On March 16th, the defendant's legal team resigned, and his case was taken over by public defense. Finally, on April 24, 2024, the second trial commenced for 5 cases of violence and 2 cases of forcible intimacy. During this time, Pradenas waived his right to remain silent and explained the events. He claimed that his crimes were committed under severe alcohol intoxication, to which the prosecutor responded that by drinking with the women, he made the victims vulnerable. On July 7, 2023, the man was found guilty. The federal prosecution demanded a sentence of 41 years in prison. On July 28, 2023, 31-year-old Martin Pradenas was sentenced to 17 years in prison for 7 intimacy-related offenses committed against 6 victims. Considering the time already spent in custody, he would serve 14 years. The tragedy that befell Antonia Barra helped expose a dangerous offender. It's unknown how many more innocent women might have suffered from his actions. The line between harassment and flirtation is very thin. One can never be prepared for someone deciding to cross that perilous line. However, the societal changes that have occurred have altered the perception of victims of violence. Now everyone understands the risks of uncontrolled desires and the inability to control oneself. Ultimately, the body and soul of another person are as fragile as a crystal vase, thus precious and inviolable. It's often said that life really begins after 40. A wealth of life experience contributes to this. For some, maturity marks a period of gaining self-confidence because not everyone has lived their life the way they wanted. For example, some people didn't know themselves or their true desires, so they followed others' advice instead. Or they might have chosen the wrong life partner. A fear of social judgment often led to taking the path of least resistance. Sometimes with age and the realization that half of one's life has passed, comes the liberation from old fears and complexes. For such individuals, turning 40 is a sort of blossoming. Once the kids are grown, they can spend more time on themselves, leave past relationships behind, and try to start new ones. Channon Starbuck, a 42-year-old woman in our story today, believed this as well. But her new hopes did not come to fruition. On December 3, 2011, Channon was found on the bedroom floor of her own home. She was lying on her back in a provocative pose. On her stomach was an erotic massager. It was clear that someone wanted to posthumously disgrace her. There was no doubt among the police that she had been criminally taken from life. Her body bore bruises and scrapes everywhere. Later, a medical examiner reported that some injuries were caused by the use of a stun gun. Other evidence suggested her body had been moved. However, the cause of Channon's demise was strangulation. Detectives faced a tough task. They needed to establish the last hours of this mother of five's life and find the criminal. The disappearance of a mother of many. The police learned of the woman's lack of contact a day before the grim discovery. Initially, her ex-husband, Clay Starbuck, raised the alarm. The 47-year-old man reported he had been unable to contact his wife since December 1st. Around 3 p.m., Channon texted her daughter that she was unable to pick up the kids from school due to feeling unwell and asked to wait for their father, whom she supposedly had informed of the change in plans. However, his phone was off, so he was unaware of the situation. Marshall and Serena, the younger brother and sister, were tired and hungry. Therefore, the 15-year-old Logan decided to call her older brother. She asked him to drive them to their father's house, located a couple of blocks from their home. Upon arrival, Austin reported that he too could not get in touch with their mother. Perhaps she had turned off her phone to rest and recover. The boy put the kids in the car and drove them to Clay's house. The man was not expecting them, but was genuinely pleased by the unexpected circumstances. After the divorce, the older children had stayed with him, and the 3 youngest with their mother. Therefore, the father decided to enjoy their company and did not disturb Channon. Moreover, such incidents had happened before with her. Besides, he expected to see his former wife at the school basketball game that evening, but she never showed up. On December 2nd, Mr. Starbuck drove the children to school and headed to his ex-wife's home. The front door was locked, and the blinds were drawn. Since he didn't have a spare key, he tried to enter, but was unsuccessful. Clay then sent a message stating that if Channon did not show up by 7 p.m., he would contact the law enforcement. After waiting until the agreed time, he went to the police and explained the situation. 2 sheriff's deputies went to the provided address, but, finding nothing suspicious, returned. The officers suggested waiting another day. If she didn't make contact by then, he should come back. Disappointed, Clay went home and waited for news. The next day, he went to the station again. Unexpectedly, they told him that his wasn't the only report. A friend and Channon's mother had also been unable to reach her. This was uncharacteristic of her. This time, the police approached the case more responsibly. 48 hours had passed since Mrs. Starbuck's disappearance, and several people were concerned. After obtaining the necessary permission, the police went to her home again. What secrets did Mrs. Starbuck's home hold? Upon arriving at the residence, officers broke the lock and entered. There were no signs of a break-in or robbery. At first glance, everything was in its place. However, the idyll was disrupted as soon as they entered the woman's bedroom. That's where the grim truth was revealed. Channon Starbuck hadn't just disappeared, she had been brutally ended. It appeared she had just gotten up. Her bed was unmade, the blanket lay nearby. The sheet was missing from the bed, and the mattress cover was stained red. The deceased's cell phone and diary were on the dresser. Forensic experts focused their attention on her room. They examined all available surfaces for fingerprints. Some had been wiped clean, but 12 latent prints were found on the massager's box and the bathroom mirror. Numerous traces were also found in common areas. For further DNA analysis, specialists took scrapings from under the nails, face, and neck of the body. Detectives suspected that the homeowner had been deprived of life after she got out of the shower, was then moved to the bed, and eventually dragged to the floor. Notably, the removed sheets were found in the washing machine. Perhaps the perpetrator wanted to remove evidence in this way. Clay sheds light on his ex-wife's lifestyle. By noon, Clay arrived at Channon's house. He was eager to find out what had happened. The scene in his ex-wife's yard did not inspire positive thoughts. The perimeter of the building was cordoned off with yellow tape, and an ambulance and several police cars were parked near the lawn. Mr. Starbuck was the first to be informed of the woman's tragic end. The detectives needed to gather any information about the victim and her lifestyle. Therefore, after the ex-husband managed to calm down a bit, they questioned him. He explained that they had an arrangement. Every morning he picked up the younger kids and took them to school, and she picked them up after school. However, this routine was sometimes disrupted. That happened on the morning of December 1st, when his car broke down a couple of blocks from home. Usually, waking up early, he would drive around the neighborhood and warm up the car. That time, Clay texted Channon and asked her to take the kids to school. He then went home to wait for it to warm up. Around 11 a.m., he tried to start the car again, but once more, it wouldn't start. Giving up, he went back inside to nap. Mr. Starbuck didn't notice as he slept for several hours. During that time, his cell phone died. To substantiate his claims, he showed the correspondence with his ex-wife. At first glance, everything added up. Moreover, Clay was very cooperative, handing over his cell phone, DNA material, and fingerprints. He also confessed that he had been worried about Channon because the divorce had changed her and made her more vulnerable. When officers asked him to elaborate, he shared that, being single, the woman had registered on a dating site. As she remained attractive, she had a wide circle of admirers. According to Clay, she might have been seeing some of them simultaneously. Following his logic, one of these lovers might have sent Channon to the afterlife. Unfortunately, he couldn't name anyone, as he didn't have such information. Throughout the conversation, Starbuck desperately cried. He explained that it was difficult for him to accept the fact of his former lover's death and to speak of her in the past tense. After recording his statement, the officers sent the man home. Poor guy had to tell the children about their mother's death. Beginning of the investigation. The case involving Channon Starbuck's demise was gathering momentum. Investigators questioned the Starbuck family's neighbors, focusing on every detail, especially reports of unfamiliar people and vehicles in recent weeks. An autopsy confirmed a chest trauma consistent with the use of a stun gun and also revealed that she had 10 broken ribs. The injuries inflicted upon her head and body were severe and likely caused by a blunt object. The external appearance of the injuries made it difficult to determine the exact time of death. The expert estimated that her life was ended sometime between December 1st and 2. Scratches on her body suggested she had been moved. Because her neck bone was broken, the medical examiner stated that something soft was used during the act of strangulation, possibly a hand, a towel, or even a sheet. A slight clarity in the case emerged from the body samples taken, including male DNA, suggesting that the suspect might be among her close male acquaintances, starting from her ex-husband to secret admirers. Channon's darker side. Hoping to catch his former wife's perpetrator quickly, Clay Starbuck cooperated fully with the investigation. He underwent an examination during which he agreed to document any injuries and damages. Detectives speculated that the perpetrator might also have sustained injuries during the struggle. However, no such injuries were found on Clay's hands. Following him, the 21-year-old Austin and 18-year-old Blake were also examined. Questions arose only regarding the older son, whose hands bore old cuts, but these were attributed to his job in a window manufacturing plant. During conversations with the children, some facts were established that were later clarified. Many of them knew that after the divorce, their mother often went on dates with men and did not approve of it. The teenagers had even seen explicit photos on her laptop, which led them to speculate that she might have been targeted by a predator operating online. It was clear that everyone loved their mother and were deeply shaken by her departure. However, they disagreed with the changes in her life. In a follow-up interview, Clay was more articulate. He blamed Channon for the family discord. While he was away on business trips, she frequently saw other men. He even admitted that he suspected that Marshall might not be his son. Nevertheless, he loved him as his own. In his view, after their relationship ended, Channon started to indulge excessively and not appropriate for her age. He disapproved of how she would drop the kids off at his place when going on another date, among other things. However, by this point, the investigators had managed not only to talk to him and the children. Having interviewed Channon's relatives and some friends, the detectives formed their own picture of the deceased and her family. The rise and fall of the Starbuck family. Channon was born on April 19, 1969, in Anderson, Indiana. She was the youngest in her family, spending her childhood with two brothers. Over time, her parents divorced and started new families, giving her additional siblings. From a young age, Channon dreamt of creating a large and loving family of her own, a vision strengthened by her active participation in church and deep faith. She grew up modest and kind-hearted, with a passion for drawing, which earned her numerous awards and prizes. At the age of 20, she met 25-year-old Clay Starbuck. Their paths crossed in Florida, where Channon had moved with her family in her youth. Clay, originally from Alaska, was vacationing in one of the warmer states. They met at a party hosted by mutual friends and immediately took to each other. That evening, Channon learned a lot about Clay, including that he had continued his education at a school for diesel mechanics in Colorado after high school, then returned home to work on the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline, making a good living. However, she discovered he was already married and had two beautiful children from that union. Channon was not deterred by his complicated past. In fact, she saw it as a positive, believing that it gave him valuable experience for married life. The couple married soon after. The newly minted Mrs. Starbuck moved in with her husband, initially struggling to adapt to the new environment and weather, but quickly settling in. However, married life wasn't as idyllic as Channon had hoped, with Clay often away, leaving her to manage the household alone. Yet love gave her strength, knowing that his work shifts would eventually end, and he would be back by her side. Meanwhile, she embraced motherhood with his children from his first marriage. It wasn't long before they had their own children together, first a son named Austin, and 3 years later, a brother for him named Blake. In 1996, their family grew again with the birth of a much-awaited daughter, Logan. But with Logan came challenges. She was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder at a young age. Channon embraced her daughter's diagnosis with grace and became her best friend. Later, another daughter brightened the Starbucks' life, whom Clay named Serena. Channon devoted her time to her children, overseeing their health, education, and church teachings. She was known throughout the community for her hobbies, cooking, and crafts. Yet, she was so immersed in her role as a caring mother and loving wife that she didn't notice when her husband began an affair at work. This was a tremendous shock to her, perceived as a deep betrayal. Consequently, in 2000, she filed for divorce, marking a new chapter in her life. Still harboring feelings for her ex-husband, she decided to move to Arizona to dull the pain of their painful separation by starting a relationship with another man. However, this attempt failed as Channon realized she still loved Clay, who was also reaching out, asking her to return. Convinced he had repented, she gave him a second chance. In 2001, the couple welcomed their son Marshall, their fifth child. Yet, Instead of solidifying their marriage, he became a new point of contention. Even a formal remarriage in 2006 could not save their fractured relationship. Awakening. 6 months later, they moved to Deer Park in Spokane County, Washington. Clay found a suitable house for their large family. He continued to work at his previous job, so he was away most of the time. Channon, left to manage the household and kids on her own, took them to movies, theaters, and parks, and organized home parties. However, doubts and distrust poisoned their marriage, further impacted by the long separations and breaks in their relationship. Ultimately, in 2010, the couple permanently separated. Crossing into her 40s, Channon began to rebuild her life, holding on to hope that she might still experience the joy of love. She resolved never to give up or repeat past mistakes. Even when Clay suffered a serious injury, she chose not to return to him. Nonetheless, she supported her ex-husband and provided whatever help she could. In February 2011, Clay left his job and settled permanently in Deer Park, staying close not just to his children, but to Channon as well. He still hoped she would return, but she did not share his view, and finally finding freedom, she enjoyed it. After undergoing surgery, Austin and Blake moved in with their father, happy to be away from under their mother's constant supervision. Channon, breathing new life, found a part-time job and enrolled in a dental assistant course. Tired of being a housewife and needing to support her family, especially as her ex-husband stopped paying child support due to his illness, she still had him nearby for emergencies. The children stayed with him after school every Wednesday, as well as the second and fourth weekends of the month. That summer, Channon proudly received her certification, marking off one dream and starting to pursue another. Hoping to meet a worthy man, she created a profile on a dating site, feeling a keen need to live for herself. She also regretted spending her best years on a man who did not appreciate her and was capable of deceit. However, a criminal plan one December morning ended her dreams. Channon Starbuck's funeral took place on December 10, 2011. A large number of people who came to the service testified to her being a bright and sincere person. She found her final resting place at a cemetery in Orlando. Search for the culprit. Public attention to the woman's death spurred law enforcement to move quickly. While focusing on her ex-husband, detectives decided to verify his alibi. As a result, they retraced Clay's movements on December 1st. He once again explained what had happened that morning and detailed where and how his car had broken down. Additionally, the results of the initial examination came in. Starbuck's fingerprints did not match any found at the crime scene. This led to a decision to check him against existing databases while also focusing on Channon's mobile phone, laptop, and personal diary. At the same time, they explored the possibility of other people being involved in the crime. After carefully examining Mrs. Starbuck's mobile phone, detectives added several names to the list of suspects. Men she had communicated with on the dating site raised suspicions. One, Tom Walker, had scheduled a date with her on December 5th. Hours before her demise, they had candid conversations and exchanged photos. Tom had asked Channon to take a photo using an adult toy, which she refused. Notably, her body was later found in the exact pose mentioned by Tom. Within an hour, Walker was located. He was shocked not only by the news, but also by being considered a suspect. He immediately explained his activities on the day of her death, which were confirmed by colleagues and surveillance cameras. Next on the list was John Wilson, who had scheduled a meeting with Channon on December 1st. From their correspondence, it was clear he was not looking for a serious relationship. Their interaction was merely casual. It also turned out that the suitor had used a fake name. His real name was John Ken Lane. He worked in a completely different field than he had claimed and was married, hence the secrecy. On the day of the crime, Channon postponed their morning meeting to a later time, citing headaches. Eventually, the date did not take place. After taking a DNA sample from him, he was released. His alibi was corroborated, even as his deception was revealed to his family. Critical evidence, After these developments, the investigation reverted to square one. While examining Channon's mobile phone, detectives made a request to the cellular service provider, uncovering another significant detail. It turned out that a 911 call was made from the victim's phone at 9:18 a.m. on the morning of December 1st, but the suspect deleted it from the call log. Thanks to a request to the emergency services, the 30-second call was retrieved. Unfortunately, it contained nothing but sobs and rustling sounds before abruptly cutting off. It was also discovered that after the failed call, the call center operator tried to return the call, but it went to voicemail. According to GPS data, Channon's mobile device was located at her home, pinpointing the exact date of her demise. She had been deprived of life after dropping her kids at school and returning home. This meant that the 11 messages sent afterward were not sent by her. The suspect tried to confuse the investigation. Moreover, he was close to the Starbuck family, as he used a nickname for the youngest son, calling him Marsh in the correspondence. After this information, Clay's statements underwent further scrutiny. He had sufficient motive for ending his ex-wife's life, divorce. Not all partners accept new realities with dignity. Moreover, he had a perfect opportunity, knowing her daily routine. Thus, authorities decided to again track the suspect's car route, this time using street surveillance camera recordings. This is where officers' suspicions took shape. Starbuck's car had not broken down. Concurrently, results from another analysis arrived. DNA material collected from Channon's body matched the suspect's samples exactly. Harsh reprisal. The scenario unfolded as follows. On the morning of December 1st, Clay sent a message to his ex-wife asking her to take the kids to school, fabricating a car breakdown. While she was out, he entered the house and waited. During this time, he accessed her unprotected laptop and found personal correspondences that infuriated the already jealous Starbuck. When Channon returned, a heated argument ensued, which ultimately led to bloodshed. This explained the unusual pose in which the deceased was found, an act of vengeance for her newfound freedom. Afterward, Clay stayed in the house, impersonating her in text exchanges. His intentions to harm his ex-wife might have been long-standing. Now, a friend's words to detectives took on new meaning. During a conversation, she mentioned that Clay and Channon's relationship was far from what it seemed. Channon had confessed in candid conversations that she was tired of his constant control and criticisms. Daring to divorce, she feared he might harm her someday. From June to November 2011, she had repeatedly contacted the police, claiming her ex-husband was stalking her. She felt unsafe even in her own home, hence did not trust anyone with the keys. Ultimately, she managed to secure a restraining order against Clay, so their communications were confined to text messages. Careful examination of Mrs. Starbuck's diary made it evident that she not only feared her former lover, but believed he was turning the children against her. He concocted vile stories and portrayed her as promiscuous. Thus, the children's reaction to their father's arrest on February 6, 2012, was not surprising. They refused to believe in his involvement. They were not perturbed by the fact that a tracking program was found on their mother's laptop and a hard drive labeled Channon's desktop computer in their father's house, along with printed correspondences. The older children doubted the authenticity of the DNA analysis, believing the accusation against their father was far-fetched and the case fabricated. However, the views of law enforcement and other relatives differed. Triumph of truth and justice. At the trial, the prosecution was confident in the man's guilt, supported by a substantial amount of physical evidence and testimonies. In June 2013, justice prevailed. Clay Starbuck was found guilty of first-degree deprivation of life under aggravating circumstances and disrespect to human remains. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In 2015, Clay's attorney filed an appeal against the verdict, but it was rejected. To this day, the perpetrator remains behind bars at the Airway Heights Correction Center in Spokane County. Channon's relatives mourn the woman's untimely departure profoundly. Yet, their hearts are even more shattered by the thought that the children sided with their father. He was so obsessed with his ex-wife that in seeking revenge, he forgot about the consequences. Unable to accept his new reality, he left his children effectively orphaned.